is no big secret, but we go back many, many years. And Gianfranco was first my professor, and when I was studying at University in Rome, where he teaches international economics. He became my advisor, or maybe I better say my mentor over time.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Hey, Gianfranco. Thank you so much for joining us. From being my professor while you were teaching in international economics at Louis University in Rome, you became my advisor, and then probably the right word is my mentor. And probably I'm not exaggerating if I say that today it's an honor calling a dear friend of mine. So I just want to say and to spend a few words introducing Professor Di Vaio's background so that you will better understand why I think, but all of us in the program committee, we thought that Gianfranco would have been an amazing chance, an amazing choice for opening today's first meeting of the Rubin's Forum. In fact, Professor Di Vaio has an academic background in political and international economy, which he is currently spending in finance. Mr. Di Vaio is the head of macro research at the CDP, the Cassa Depositi Prestiti, which maybe many of you may not know, but is the financial holding of the Italian government. CDP is the investment bank of the government, which in very, very simple word, it means that it's a tool that is used to support the Italian economy. So what it's more interesting is that while Professor Di Vaio is coming from a humanistic background and is in humanistic studies, and he has a PhD in economic history, he was able to transform his knowledge and apply to an extremely, I would say, practical field as finance and macroeconomics are. So I think that's exactly the value added of today's presentation and what he's going to talk with us about. That it's something that probably we rarely see in our department. So I'm very, very happy. And without further delay, I know how much every single hour of Gianfranco's time is worth, really. And I'm really grateful for him to be joining us today in this presentation. And it's really an honor that he's joining us in my Tel Aviv family. So please, Gianfranco, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bianca. Please, you have been a little bit exaggerating. It's an honor to me to have been invited by Tel Aviv University for giving this speech today. And it's an honor and a pleasure because it is something related to my half part of my career, which is the one more, as you said correctly before, more academic. So it's always a pleasure interact with students at every level, undergraduate, postgraduate, PhD level, or postdoc level, whatever. So thanks again for this invitation. You already spent many words about me, so I will not give you other extra information. Probably one thing that is mentioned, that is worth to be mentioned, is that you said correctly that I started my studies in history. It is true, and I think it was a great value added for my career because it gave me this, let me say, the flexibility to look at the macro problems, economic problems, and also quantitative aspects. Because during my career, I've been specializing in macroeconometric, which is statistics, basically econometrics applied to macro phenomena, particularly to the field of economic growth. So basically investigating the process of economic development and convergence across countries in the very long run from a statistical background. So basically from a statistical standpoint, so applying statistical methods to the economics. And doing all of this, my previous experience in the historical field was very important because this history gave me the possibility to understand all these things also from a historical perspective, highlighting the role which is very, very important for the study of economic of institutions. and everything that in a way basically regulate the function of the market. You know that there have been a lot of economic historians studying this field. I can mention probably only Douglas North to let you understand this kind of studies. So the role of history and institution in economic development is very important, and that gives me a plus, so a value added to my career, to my experience. As Bianca Maria said, at some point after being qualified as associate professor in economic policy, I came to work here, where I am today, in CDP, which is Cassa Depositi e Prestiti. For those who know this kind of institutions, I don't know if you have something similar. I think maybe not, but in Europe we have, in the major European countries, in Germany, in France, in Spain, something similar to the Cassa Depositi, which is the KfW in Germany, the CDC in France, which is the Cassa de Depot et Consignation, and we have ICO, which is the Instituto de Crédito Oficial in Spain. So basically are development banks. So the banks that are owned by the government, particularly the Ministry of Finance, which basically support the economy. So invest in the economy in the very long run to promote, large infrastructure, to give monies to SMEs, etc. But today I will be talking about the crisis, the current crisis, which is the topic of today's lecture, probably trying to put into a broader context, also in historical experience of what we saw in the past with the previous crisis. As I understand, the lecture will be given in this way. I will give you, let's say, a broad overview in 20 minutes, and then we open for a sort of Q&A, right? So question and answers. But I will keep it very interactive. So if you have questions during my talk, please raise your hand, and we can interact also during the overview. So the current crisis, as all of you know, the current crisis is very unprecedented in every aspect, in the magnitude, because it was by far the worst crisis that the world saw at least in modern times, even worse than the global financial crisis, the crisis of the 70s. It has been compared to the crisis of World War II, to the Great Depression of the 20s, and the crisis induced by World War I. So when you look at all these crises, the crisis that we are currently observing is much worse. In terms of magnitude, typically economists use one single indicator to define a crisis. When you have 3 consecutive quarters of contraction of GDP in real terms. So when there is a minus sign before the growth of GDP from one quarter to another, and when you have 3 consecutive quarters of minus sign in front of GDP growth, it means, technically speaking, it means crisis. The numbers are big. For Italy, we have, of course, 2020 is not completed yet, but now we are in October, so we have reasonable estimate of the evolution of GDP in the current year. For Italy, we have a contraction in the range of -9%, -10%, which is a lot. Consider that in the global financial crisis and after that in the sovereign debt crisis, you probably know that, you remember that in Europe, contrary to the rest of the world, we had 2 crises before this one. The rest of the world had the global financial crisis and then a recovery up to the current crisis. We in Europe had 2 crises. So we had the global financial crisis, then after that we had a recovery. And because of the sovereign debt of the peripheral countries in Europe, you remember Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and then Italy, because of the sustainability of the burden of debt of this country, we had another crisis, something that the economists call double dip. When you have a crisis, a recovery, and then once again another crisis. So we had the sovereign debt crisis in a very short period of time, in 10 years. And this is a third dramatic crisis. So we had 3 crises in 10 years, which is very, very severe for the European economy. And again, this crisis is much worse. Consider that during the global financial crisis in Italy, we had like around -5 in terms of real GDP growth. So today we are speaking about -10, so exactly the double. So much more severe. This is the first aspect that we can observe of the current crisis. We have another aspect, which is this. This time the crisis is symmetric. Basically, because of the virus is spreading all over the world across the countries, the crisis is hitting at the same moment, in the same period of time, every economy in the world. If you remember in the past crisis, think about the global financial crisis, we had the advanced country, which were in a recession because of the crisis started, if you remember, in the United States, particularly from the housing sector, no? The mortgage, the subprime mortgage loans, but was an issue related to the advanced countries. We did not see any crisis in the emerging countries. Today, we see that the crisis is symmetric, so it's hitting, so it's impacting negatively all the countries, advanced, middle income, emerging. And this has an implication which is particularly negative, which is the global trade. So at the time of the global financial crisis and at the time of the sovereign debt crisis for an economy like Italy, which is very depending on the external demand, which is the export, basically, which is related to the global trade, the possibility to have a channel for GDP growth, a positive channel coming from global trade, was very positive. Indeed, in Italy at the time, we had the component of GDP related to the internal demand, which are consumption of households, so private consumption, investment of the private sector, and public spending, so government expenditure, which were very depressed. But at the time, at least we had one single component, which was very positive in terms of contribution to GDP, that was the external demand, which is trade, basically, so export to global trade. This time, unfortunately, we don't have the external demand because global trade is ruined because of the crisis worldwide in a symmetric way. And also, you have other structural factors of uncertainty, which are negatively impacting trade, which are not related to the pandemic, but are related to geopolitical tensions. So, you know, the issue of tariffs and protectionism policies between the United States and China on the one side. You have the Brexit issue, so the exit of the UK from the European Union. So all these things are putting tensions on global trade and are raising the level of uncertainty at a record high. Consider that economists or operators in the financial markets typically looks at 2 kinds of uncertainty measure. One is the volatility index that basically look at the volatility of the stock market. Another one is policy uncertainty. So it's uncertainty related to the political landscape. So this time, while the volatility of the stock market has been reducing after the diffusion of the pandemic, we have that uncertainty related to the policy context is still at a very high level. So we have the pandemic, so basically the main cause of the crisis, but we have other structural factors which are related to geopolitical considerations. This is another aspect which is very different with respect to the previous crisis. So first of all, we have the magnitude of the crisis, which was much worse. We have the fact that the crisis is symmetric, so negatively impacting all the countries, either advanced or emerging, developing at the same time. And we have the uncertainty at the global level, which is at a very high peak at the moment. Another aspect of the crisis is the one related to the mechanics of the crisis. So typically you might have a crisis coming from the demand side when you have a depression. Think about the 20s in the United States, for instance. You might have supply side crisis, so coming from the supply. Think about the 70s, no? At the time of the oil shocks. Which was related also to issue that you know very well in Middle East, no? So that was a crisis of supply. Typically, crises coming from the supply side have an impact on the prices. You remember the time of hyperinflation in the very high inflation in the 70s that induced the so-called stagflation. What is stagflation? It was a new term that was basically introduced in the 70s. So you had at the time a recession of GDP and at the same time increase in prices. So you had the stagnation but inflation. So you had the stagflation at the time. So this time we had the combination of the two. So both demand and side effect from the crisis. Why? Demand side because of basically due to the lockdown, people can't consume, because they, at the time of the very strict and severe lockdown in Italy we had in March, people couldn't go anymore outside to buy things. So they couldn't go out to buy, houses or cars or, durable goods or whatever. So you had depression of the demand side, but also depression from the supply side, because there was a disruption of the global value chain. No, you know that production at the world level is basically located in, so above all for multinational firms, is located worldwide. So every single final good is composed by many different goods that we call intermediate goods, and these goods are basically inserted in global value chain. So let's say that one piece of the final good is produced in South Korea, and then it is put together in Europe and then exported again in United States as a final good. So from South Korea through Italy to United States, you have a global value chain. And in this global value chain, you have several disruptions, so impacting negatively on the supply side. So the market at the time was totally dislocated, in a sense. So this is another difference. So we said up to now that was much more severe in terms of magnitude. It was symmetric, and it was related to both demand and supply side. These are the very, let's say, differences, the main differences that made this crisis much worse than before. Now we have also positive aspects. Well, positive is a sort of, it's paradoxical, so positive in the negative of now situation of the crisis, in the sense that contrary to the previous crisis, at this time we had a quick reaction, very, very active, let me say, and coordinated from policymakers and from the central banks. So you had a quick reaction from the Fed, from the Federal Reserve System in the United States, which is the system of central bank for US, and a very strong reaction from the ECB, from the European Central Bank, that you know is the central bank for the monetary union in Europe. And in a parallel way, we had a reaction from policymakers, so from the governments, which introduced extremely expansionary fiscal policies. This was very different with respect to the previous crisis. So when we look at the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, we didn't have any expansionary fiscal policy. Why? Because the public sector was ruined. So it was not possible at the time to inject liquidity in the economy, to do public spending, because the public sector was basically not in the possibility to do that, because the sustainability of debt was not guaranteed on the financial markets, because there was no intervention of the ECB. So at the time, we did not have the ECB stabilizing the markets. So the spread, which is the basically, I think many of you should know what a spread is. Basically, is the difference in terms of yields between a government bond of a specific country, can be Italy, can be Spain or Greece or whatever, the difference between this bond and a risk-free asset, typically the Bund, so the 10-year government bond of the German government is considered a risk-free asset, no? So when you compute this difference in terms of yields, this is the spread. What is a spread? Basically, it's a measure of country risk, no? So basically, investors are not willing to invest in that bond for a yield which is very low, because they perceive a much higher risk. Of course, this increases the interest that the government has to pay when they issue bonds, and which makes the public finance unsustainable at some point. So this time we are not seeing this. Why? Because in the secondary market, there is the ECB, which immediately launched a massive program of liquidity, which is called PEP, basically a program of asset purchases against the pandemic. So trillions of euros injected in the economy to stabilize the financial markets, and particularly the markets of the sovereign debt. And that policy made fiscal policies, made expansionary fiscal policy possible, because government all over Europe were able to issue bonds and to use that money to do expansionary fiscal policies. Which kind of policies? But more or less, they were the same all over the world, also in the United States, same schemes. First of all, to support households, so giving benefits for unemployed people. You saw that in the United States, the application for unemployment benefits reached a peak in US history. So we are speaking about 1 million people asking for benefits for unemployed. Schemes to support people at work, so short-term schemes. And in Italy, we call Cassa Integrazione Guadagni. I think it's the English name for this is Farlof schemes, something like that. And support to firms, to SMEs, not to manage the crisis in terms of liquidity. So guarantee schemes to make the banking system able to give credit to the firms without incurring in losses or getting. So there was a guarantee from the government, from the German government, from the Italian government, from the French government. So guarantee on the bank loans to SMEs in a way that banks were not taking on their balance sheet the risk of coming from the firm, and could go on in expanding the credit to the non-financial corporation, to the economy. And this is very different and positive with respect to the previous crisis. So this time we had a combination and, let's say, coordination between fiscal policies and monetary policies. So in the case of Europe, we had national government, the Italian government, through several decree laws that were introduced, and working, let's say, in a combination of tools with the ECB, with the European Central Bank. Another aspect very positive was that this time we had not only intervention at the national level in Europe, but we have an intervention at the supranational level. So we had the policies and the tools introduced by the national governments, but we had also a strong reaction coming from the European institution. And this reaction was divided in short-term instruments and long-term instruments. So the short-term instruments were basically something that worked as a backstop for liquidity in the very short time, in the outbreak, at the time of the diffusion of the crisis, no? Basically through three kind of tools that were the European Stability Mechanism, which was a tool to give loans to government for healthcare expenditure, the SURE, which was a mechanism for people at risk of being unemployed, and guarantee schemes coming from the EIB, the European Investment Banks, to give liquidity to the firm. Then the other leg, so these two legs, one for the short term, the other one for the long term, came from the European Commission, which is what we call Next Generation EU, which is the recovery fund, so the European Recovery Fund. So funds which will go to basically subsidize, so we're speaking about grants and also loans, but these funds will go to finance investments for the very long term for the recovery of the economy. So let's say infrastructure, let's say digitalization, let's say innovation, let's say research and development, let's say circular economy, let's say green economy, all the factors related to the transition to a sustainable economy, etc. So we had intervention for tools for the short term and tools for the long term. So the combination of reaction between monetary policies, fiscal policies at the national, supranational level was really a novelty of the response of this crisis in terms of response from the authority, from the policymakers and the government with respect to the previous crisis. At the time of the global financial crisis, and also at the time of the sovereign debt crisis, we didn't have any, at least in Europe, any really lender of last resort, no, in terms of central bank, because at the time the ECB did not introduce at the time of the explosion, let's say, of the crisis, did not had tools like quantitative easing or to inject liquidity in the economy to stabilize the markets. No? After the era of Mario Draghi, that you know was the governor of the chairman of the European Central Bank for a very long time, we had a change in the perspective of let's say in the way through which the ECB was managed. And basically, now the ECB started to introduce these tools for support the economy in time of crisis. And we saw that at this time, these tools were very, very powerful in stabilizing the financial market. Indeed, if you look at the spread, which is the country risk for European countries this day, you see that they are at a very minimum level with respect to the previous crisis. So this is positive. Another positive aspect is that so on the one side you have the uncertainty coming from the crisis, which is related to the factor that we mentioned before, and is also related to another factor, which is strictly related to the possibility for the discovery of the vaccine. So we don't know when the healthcare system will be able. So we don't know the time. So we know they are working to find a cure or something to solve the situation, but we at the moment can't foresee when this kind of vaccine will be introduced. and this generates uncertainty for the future. So people are trying to simulate what the impact of a new generalized lockdown will be on the economy for the coming months. So they are thinking in terms of scenario. So worst scenario, if you have new generalized lockdown all over Europe, best case scenario in which you have a discovery of a cure against the virus. You have a baseline, probably will go on at a speed which is very similar to the current one. So major source of uncertainty is coming from basically healthcare, also coming from the possibility for the healthcare system to assist all the people, that have been infected, by the virus. So we know that there are limited, spaces, division in the hospital that that can provide intensive care to this kind of people. So if they are if they go under pressure again, like in March very soon, this might create again a problem to the sustainability of the system. So this is the main source of uncertainty. But if we remove this source of uncertainty, it is very reasonable to think about a very quick and sharp recovery. So for 2021, for the coming year, now all the forecaster coming from the International Monetary Fund to the OECD, passing through the European Commission and the consensus or Oxford Economics or whatever, any kind of forecaster is foreseeing a recovery for the next year. So GDP growth rate will turn into positive territory once again. So we're speaking about plus in front of GDP growth, which is another different aspect. So in Italy, after the global financial crisis, and because of the double dip, we saw almost 10 years of depression in which GDP was in negative territory for several years, one after the other, let's say in a row. This time, the possibility for a recovery is reasonable, but is related to the evolution of the pandemic, of course. So if we remove this source of uncertainty, so if we solve the issue of the pandemic, it's reasonable that we have a very quick jump, And we are already observing in several, let's say, several indicators, cyclical indicators, short-time indicators, like, for instance, retail sales, industrial production. If you also look at this new index that people are looking now, think about the Google Mobility Index, basically people that track the mobility, index that tracks the mobility of people, which is closely related, of course, to economic activity and the capability for people to spend money, consumption of energy. All these things are sending positive signal. In Italy, the industrial production already showed a perfect V-shaped recovery. What is V-shaped? So you are going this way, then you have the crisis, and then you have a V-shaped recovery, which is this shape. So the level of industrial production is back again at the pre-crisis, at the pre-pandemic level, So which is very good. So because it means that you reached the level before the crisis in a very short period of time. Of course, if the pandemic will last also for a month and we will see a new lockdown, this V-shaped recovery might be not a V, as I said before, but might be an imperfect V, like a U-shape, so prolonged, or even L-shape. So you have a drop, then you stay depressed, and then you start to recover. So there is also debate about the shape of the recovery from the crisis. I think more or less I touched upon all the things that I wanted to mention. Probably stock market. So the financial markets, in China, the spreading of the virus was end of January, more or less. So there are some university departments that are measuring the contagion, the numbers of contagion worldwide. I think one is in Oxford, it's based in Oxford. Anyway, looking at all these indicators, it is common knowledge now that the crisis in China started to diffuse at the end of January. At the time, what we saw on the global financial market, on the stock market, we saw that the crash was limited to the Eastern Asian stock market, particularly the Shanghai Stock Exchange, which was very local to the Chinese situation. So the rest of the stock market indexes, like, the Dow Jones or the S&P, the NASDAQ in the United States, or the FTSE for UK, the Euro stocks in Europe, whatever. The stock market in the rest of the world were not affected. When there was the total collapse, when the crisis started in Italy, end of February, because market at the time said, okay, the situation is serious and also involve Western countries. So, and because of fears of contagion through financial markets, there was a huge collapse in the stock markets all over the world. Now, after that, again, we see a quick recovery, much quicker than the previous crisis. We have the stock market much more depressed at the time of the global financial crisis. Why? Because the crisis was coming from the financial market, because we have many toxic assets in the balance sheet of the bank, no? At the time. So the banks had to, clean all these things from their balance sheet over the years, no? Now situation is different. The banking system worldwide, because the massive cure that they did after the global financial crisis, are in a much better shape. So the balance sheet of the banks today are much stronger than in the past. So have the capability to, offset the risks coming from the pandemic. So this probably explains why we didn't see any contagion factors from the real economy and the financial markets. Another aspect which is positive is this. By far, banks are less indebted than in the past. Households in advanced countries, but particularly in Europe and in Italy, are in a good shape, let's say. So liquidity of households in Italy is very high. The households' wealth in Italy is quite high. It's about 10 trillion euros, so close to 2 times Italian the disposable income of households. Not 2 times, 10 times, of course, or 8, 9 times. This wealth is divided in financial and non-financial wealth. Financial, of course, are stocks, shares, bonds, etc. Non-financial is basically real estate, properties, etc. So it's very high. The liquidity is high. The Italian households have 1.6 trillion of liquidity deposited in bank accounts, so ready to be used. It is cash. Okay, so they can resist for a long period of time the crisis. Consider that at the time of the sovereign debt crisis, we didn't observe any social unrest in Italy. We didn't observe any syntagma square like in Greece in Italy. We didn't see banks attacked by people, because in the end the social connection in Italy showed a resilience, to all of these things, and the same is happening now in the pandemic crisis. So this is probably something which is common to the past crisis, but probably we are in a better shape now to resist to the pandemic. One key factor of that is worrying for a policymaker above all is of course the sustainability of debt, because fiscal policies, the expansionary fiscal policies, have been carried out through deficit spending. No? So this will upload other extra public debt on top of the current one. But again, if the recovery is fast, so what matters is not the level of the debt, okay? It's the ratio of the debt over GDP, which is the variable that you have to look at in terms of sustainability. Think about Japan. Japan historically had an extremely high level of debt and also extremely high ratio of debt over GDP. We are speaking about 200%, but the Japanese debt has been always sustainable for several kind of reasons. Okay. Then Japanese is another issue because Japanese economy is very much related to demography, etc. But we can't enter in this aspect now. So for European countries, namely Italy and then Spain and probably France, there will be a problem of burden of debt. But again, we have the ECB, which is stabilizing the markets and make the debt sustainable. And if the recovery is quite fast, we hope that the ratio of debt, public debt, government debt over GDP will start to decline again right after the crisis. I think I can stop here. I'm sorry if I gave this speech, which was a little bit scattered, touching upon many things, but I hope that at least you have one common factor putting all the pieces together.
Thank you very much for your presentation, exactly because you opened a very wide spectrum for us to discuss. And as Bianca said, I mean, obviously COVID-19 and its implications are very much on everyone's mind. And here at the School of History, there is a large number of scholars and students who are interested in various aspects of pandemics. And now you add the financial aspect to it. So thank you very much. And I want to start our discussion by going back to your background as a historian. And I want to ask you, being a historian, and what we historians do, we try to point out and explain continuities, differences, similarities. I want to ask you, exactly because you talked about how this crisis is unique. As a historian, in what ways do you think it actually echoes patterns that we do see from history? Because one of the things that I can think about, and I'm curious to hear what you think, you talked about the multitudes of crises as a unique aspect of the current one, but I think about previous crises. For example, the climate crisis in the beginning of the 16th century and other such examples that were exactly that. The accumulation of problems that became overwhelming. So as a historian of economy, what do you think?
I think that it's something which is related to the standpoint, no, from which we observe reality. So history gives us the possibility to learn lessons from the past. And this, I think, should be the driver of to interpret the present, and but for a limited way for the future. So lessons learned from the past crisis were the driver of the current choices of the public choices, the current choices of the policymakers. So learning from what happened in the sovereign debt crisis. And what we failed at the time was the main driver of the intervention of the ECB in the economy, which is giving extremely powerful help to come to go out from this crisis. No, so I think history is fundamental for the approach, which should be comparative, and I would say that not only over time, but also across space. So looking at other, of course, history is the story of the past, but you can look at as a matrix in 2 dimensions, you can look at the past, but also across space, no, to compare experiences in the past and across countries, no. And but in my everyday job, when I have to do a task which is new to me, I have to produce, let's say, a note or a report for the top management of the bank, or on a particular aspect, or on a particular, what I do at the very first time is, okay, let's see if there is something similar in the past or in another country. So the comparative aspect, I think, is fundamental. And I think the memory. So memory is crucial. And believe me, not only in social sciences and in history, but also in statistics and mathematics. Think that the analysis of the data from a statistical standpoint incorporates a lot of aspects coming from the memory, which is the past of the data. And if you don't look at the behavior of that data in the past, you are not able to correctly to manage the data. And you are not in a position to use the correct model. So I will say, to make comparison, I will say to learn lesson, I will say memory, I will say persistence. So you have patterns, so you have paths which are persistent in time. And if you do not look from historical standpoint at these paths, probably you are missing the main piece of the story. So I will speak in terms of methodological aspects. And as I said also before, what is very important is also the role of interaction between societies, human being, and structures related, not, the interaction between institutions that can be political institution, but also economic institution. There is a very talented US economist, Turkish origin, which is Daron Acemoglu, which studied a lot the role of de jure and de facto institution and the importance that they have for the economic development and the difference that they can produce in terms of development between countries, no, in the world, worldwide. My case basically was this one. At the time I was studying the differences in terms of development, so the gap in terms of economic development between north and south of Italy. You know that in Italy we have this southern area, the southern regions, so, Sicily, Calabria, Naples, and Apulia, etc. So this we call the Mezzogiorno of Italy, which is the south, that historically has been underdeveloped or at least lacking behind, no? With respect to the northern regions. So think that income per capita of citizens in the south, of people in the south, has been constantly at the ratio of 50% of income per capita of the north, of the northern people. So I was studying contemporary history at the time of the Italian Republic. And at some point I faced this issue. So how can we explain this underdevelopment? How can we explain this underdevelopment and persistent path between north and south in the very long run? And at the time, I said, okay, I need some economic background, otherwise I would not understand. So at the time, there was a total mix in my personal experience of historical aspect and economic aspect in, let's say, in a broader social science picture. No, that was the, I would say this way.
Thank you very much. I mean, one point that I take from your answer, and I think it is important to echo it further. We are so accustomed to think about the east-west axis, and you mentioned the north-south axis, and this is in the particular case of Italy, but globally, this is certainly something to bear in mind, the north and south rather than east and west. And this is the moment when we open the floor, and I see several participants who are already raising hands. Sergey, we'll start with you, and then Salwa and Oded, you are next. So Sergey, please.
Hello to all. My name is Sergey, and I'm from East Asian Studies Department. And I have two questions. First question is, what do you think is the influence of this crisis on politics? What tendencies do you see? For example, I know that one of the reasons for the Nazi seizure of power in Germany and Japanese aggression was the world economic crisis. And I also want to add that originally I'm came to Israel from Ukraine. I'm very interested in Ukrainian politics, and many political experts they was talking before that Russia probably can use this situation and make some kind of aggression against Ukraine, because all other countries are busy with pandemics. They don't interested in what happens elsewhere. And many people also, many political experts also say that the war now between Germany, between Azerbaijan and between Armenia has also something to do with these pandemics, because Western countries are not so interested. The interest in what happens could be much bigger than without these pandemics. So this is the first question. What do you think the political influence can be the political influence of this crisis? And the second question, what will be the influence on the development of renewable energy technologies? Because the oil prices dropped. I know that before the crisis, we had a very quick development of the green sources of energy. So what do you think will happen because of this crisis?
Okay, so I will try not to enter in aspects that I don't know very well. Otherwise, I will lose my credibility. So, because typically when I don't know something, I prefer not to speak. Otherwise, no, if you speak about everything, you lose credibility. So, frankly speaking, I can react to your question, which is, no, by the way, it's extremely interesting. So I get the point. Probably I'm not the right person to give answer to the politics in East Europe, East Asia. But I can tell you what I'm observing more or less worldwide. So a crisis for the political system can be always considered as exogenous shocks. So it is something which, in a way, positive, either positive or negative, put pressure on the status quo, so on the political system. So much depends on the capability for politicians to manage the crisis and to solve issues of the people, or at least of the majority of people. So if you have many discontent or many people which are suffering from the crisis and don't see answers or coming from politics at some time, at least in the democratic countries, they will vote against the political parties which are at the government at the moment. In the past, for instance, think about the global financial crisis. Before global financial crisis, probably we didn't know, or probably we forgot totally the term populism, no? So probably populism was, before the financial crisis, was something which was related to dictatorship in the 30s or in the 40s, probably to Nazi or fascist state, no? Or the way through which dictators were able to manage large mass and waves of people, no? Through populistic, arguments, policies. And after the global financial crisis, we saw once again the rise of populism all over the world, no? This also in Italy. We have there were new anti-establishment parties that were basically opponent to the status quo, so to the previous political system. So on the one side, for sure, crises are an exogenous shock for the political system and create basically fracture, and then may produce even the establishment of new political parties never seen before. The populism was a reaction to the globalization, So because no one explained to people that were suffering in the Western world that their situation was related to, globalization worldwide, some forces, and that protectionism was not the right answer to globalization, because protectionism in the end increased prices at home, so it's bad for consumers. It might be good for some producers if they can produce, being in a sense subsidized by protectionistic policies by the government. But the final result, as an economist, I have to say that is an increase of prices for the consumers in that country. So probably political parties were not, traditional political parties were not able to explain, these democratic parties or liberal parties were not able to explain correctly this dynamic to population. So all these people suffering because of loss of income and because they were losing their purchasing parity due to globalization, they were totally mad at traditional political parties, and they started to vote for populistic parties. So you have the case of Leave in UK for the Brexit, but Trump also, in a sense, in the United States, or in Italy we also have in Germany they have populistic parties. So for sure, crisis induce, as I said, a shock for the political system. Now, the result is not really predictable. If the traditional or the parties, political parties, which have power at the moment, are able to manage the crisis, they can survive in the future. But if they are not able to manage, of course, probably they will lose progressively, power. So this is what can I say for a very broad point of view. Then you have specific cases related to Ukraine or Azerbaijan or whatever, but honestly, I don't have enough knowledge to speak about that.
The second question was about renewable.
The green. No. This is interesting. I think yes. Why? I think now probably all the countries worldwide, all the big corporations and big financial institutions are looking at sustainability as a core issue, as a core aspect of their business model. So everywhere, I would say everywhere, everyone is looking at SDG, so the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. Also investor, they want to invest in a responsible way. So they want to invest in products, in financial assets that which underlying is sustainable in terms of environmental impact, in terms of social impact, in terms of also governance, in terms of gender disparity, etc. So given that, for instance, in Europe, we are introducing this massive fiscal policy through the tools that I mentioned before, all these things will be done, so will be invested in under sustainable criteria. So this is I think it's a good push in terms of increasing the share of the economy which is green, which is sustainable, which is social. So I think the impact is positive in this case.
Thank you very much. And I want to invite Salwa. Let me introduce you, Dr. Salwa Alinat, our postdoc this year. Please, Salwa.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. It's very interesting. And I want to ask you about maybe your personal point of view about what our responsibility as citizens. You know, you talk about the policymakers, you talk about, the high policymakers in this level. And I want to ask about us as the citizens. From one side, we are, it's not just an economic crisis, it's also healthy crisis. It demands from us to be separated, to keep distance from each other physically and sometimes maybe or psychology. So what you can advise us as citizens, what do you do as a citizen, as an Italian citizen, in order to improve the situation, in order, everybody wants to have his part of this in this situation in order to improve it. What do you think?
Very good point. I think all these things that you mentioned are interrelated. It's a health crisis, but the health crisis also is related to the economic crisis because of the resources that have to flow, from the markets, from the governments, to the healthcare, to the health system to take care of the patients and to take care. So if you have economic crisis and health crisis together, it's very, very bad because you don't have enough resources for to inject, And I think the citizens, we have been totally surprised by this crisis, negatively, of course. But to tell you the truth, there's been literature for years about the fact that countries should have been protecting themselves from the risk of catastrophes, pandemics. You know that the World Bank issued an insurance product which is called CAT bonds, which are catastrophe bonds. So are forms of schemes of insurance for countries or companies to protect against risks which are unpredictable and coming from natural disasters, catastrophes, pandemics. Probably we were totally surprised under this respect in advanced countries, but also in emerging markets. And as a citizen, we have to be extremely responsible. I think it's a very subtle equilibrium between the functioning of the economic system and our everyday life, and what we do to not contribute to diffuse even more the pandemic. So I think we can't, so we have to take care of the economy, because if we freeze everything once again, it will be very difficult. So we need to find ways to continue to live everyday life in taking into consideration the pandemic. Think about the changing of the way we work. So probably this meeting before the pandemic will never happen in this way, but probably I was taking a flight from Rome, coming to Tel Aviv and giving a speech in presence, no? This way we are interacting through an internet platform, no? So also it's the future of work which is changing. So we have to get used to that. Of course, we have to limit all the things that contribute to diffuse the virus. So in presence of other people, of course, we need to respect social distancing. We have to use this one or this other one. This is more powerful, this one, or we can combine all together. We have to take seriously care to avoid further pressure on the hospitals and on the expenditure for healthcare by the government. I think we have to explore new ways of interaction, new ways of working. After the other crisis, what we had a reallocation of people from some sectors to another. I think that this way, this time we will see something similar. So we have reallocation of people from one sectors to other sectors, probably sales, or if you need to buy food or whatever, you will in the coming months never think again to go by person to the supermarket or whatever, but probably you will order your food through a delivery, an internet a platform or whatever, but the result is the same. So it's changing the way in which we do things. And I think if we do these things in a responsible way, I think it's the only, we can give a help to each other in defeating this pandemic issue, which of course is horrible. I have 2 kids, and well, kids now they are growing up. The first one is starting the first year of the high school, is 14 years old. The other one is almost 10. For them it was very, very, it's impacted a lot to do lecture and go to school in a virtual way, through a virtual classroom, through the computer, because of interaction with other kids. And I think about sports. Basically, the possibility to do sports was basically prohibited at the time of the lockdown. So for them, I think, for them that they are in the childhood, they are growing up, it will be something that will last in their, in their memories, in their. But I think we have all the resources as human beings to find the new ways to go on and manage the crisis.
Thank you very much. And now it's Dr. Oded Rabinovitch turn. Please, Oded.
Thank you for this talk, and I need to preface what I'm about to say by saying that I do take COVID-19 very seriously. I've been hardly outside the house for a month. But what I'm trying to ask is to follow on Miri's earlier point, and to say that in the dialogue between historians and people coming from economics, perhaps our role is to try to go beyond economic indicators and look at other realities which can serve as checks to just looking at economic data. And when you look globally at other indicators about the current situation, I think there are arguments for making a much more optimistic case than the case you have been making based on the economic data. Starting from the fact that I was quarantined for the first time in March. So I had a lot of free time locked up in a room to read about future developments. And even at the time, serious informed doctors were saying that we'll have a vaccine in about 18 months. And in spite of all the fake news that we've had about this prediction seems fairly realistic. When we're looking at the damages to the real economy, beyond the economic indicators, and you brought up World War II as an example, but no European city has been carpet bombed over the past few months. Even in a country which has really had a very bad policy reaction like the UK, the death toll is just like in the scale of the bombing of Coventry in World War II. It's just like one event. And another thing is when you look at indicators in context, speaking about something which is deficit numbers in and of itself is something which I find very lacking or problematic, because deficit numbers don't really tell us a lot unless we're talking about why the debts were incurred. And if they were incurred because the government initiated profligate programs, this is bad debt. But here we're looking at a debt which is much more of an investment for future generations, because it's supposed to prepare the groundwork for the recovery, which hopefully will be as close to boot-shaped as possible. So going beyond the pure economic indicators and looking at other realities, and then looking even at indicators in context, I think can present a more optimistic case, which, I hope will come to fruition. I've been locked up for way too long, but also has a methodological point, which is that perhaps one should use history as a way to rethink or not to exaggerate this kind of feeling that you only live in a world of economic indicators. One needs to go beyond them if you really want to understand what they mean. I hope this makes sense if I put it this way.
I got your point, but let me ask you, before to reply, let me ask you one thing. So what do you mean precisely by historic indicators, which are beyond the economic indicators?
Right now, I've just been talking about realities which are not purely captured in narrow economic data. I'm a specialist in early modern history, what is Storia Moderna, not in contemporary history. And I don't know a lot about the current numbers in Europe, but even based on this limited information, which is perhaps not properly captured in economic indicators, one can start to contextualize them and present a different case.
No, I'm quite sympathetic with you in the sense that this is what makes the current crisis different with respect to previous crisis, because of the fact that the productive system has not been bombed. Once the lockdown will finish or it finished like after March, they restarted again in a very quick way the production. So you don't see the long time needed to, even though after World War II, in the end, even though the productive system was totally disrupted and ruined by the war, thanks to the Marshall Plan, the golden age. Also, we saw the golden age of the Western economy. So they rebuilt in a very quick time the productive system that was disrupted. So what I think is that on the first part of your point, as I said before, much will be related to the possibility to recover for the economy, and this is much more related to the confidence and sentiment of people, living in the market and populating the economy. Because the debt, I agree with you, per se, so itself, the debt is not a problem. What is a problem? It's the sustainability of the debt. Now, how can you sustain a debt? You have to service the cost of the debt. Now, it's clear that if the economy is not able to grow enough to sustain the payment of the interest on that debt, you go bankruptcy. And in that case, you have a huge financial shock. You are like Greece, in a few years ago. And then you have banks which are not giving money to firms, above all small and medium enterprises. You have unemployment. You have people without getting wages, and a negative spiral. So there is some positive elements that you were correctly mentioning before that are different and are working that are giving positive signal for a recovery. I think much will depend on the evolution of the pandemic, which, even though we know probably that a vaccine is very soon to be found and discovered, remember that in other cases it was not so easy to find think about the HIV, for instance, so in the end we got used to that, and we were able to continue the development of the society, taking care of taking into account that negative aspect. On the second point, historic indicators, or I think it's a mix of, I think the two things speak to each other in a sense, because economic indicators are strictly linked to social phenomena and vice versa. Think about migration in historical perspective. So if you look at the history of migration, but why several million people left the old world at the time, at the end of the 19th century, to go and live into the new world, to the Americas, at the time, they were looking for a better life, Why people, are departing from, sub-Saharan Africa to try to find a job in Northern European countries, to trying to live a better life, So the two dimensions, I think, are strictly related, and I agree with you. If you look only at one side or at one single standpoint, you miss the big picture, which is something that make you really aware about the complexity of the reality.
Thank you very much, Roy Weintraub. I see that you raise your hand.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for your talk. My BN is economics, and I think in 2011, when the Italian bond was 7%, I was in a hedge fund. So now to look at the Italian 10 years bond at
you made a lot of money. You made a lot of money at the time. You lost.
No, not me. It was the fund manager, but I was the analyst. But it was an interesting time, and it's especially interesting to see now the Italian 10-year bond at 0.7. And so maybe my question, it will not be about a hedge fund and a position in the market, but more conceptually, the value of money these days. When we see, the Fed and also the European Central Bank, printing a lot of money, the rates are sometimes negative. And more and more people are thinking about Bitcoin and other alternative. We saw the gold going almost to 2,000. So I'm taking the opportunity to talk with the leading Italian economists. What is your perspective as Italian government raising at 0.7? And what does it mean on the value of our money?
No, I don't think that this is another big difference with respect to the previous crisis. By the way, if you invested at the time in the Italian BTPs, providing you with a yield of 7%, now you would have been making a lot of money, because we are still here in place paying the interest on our bonds. So it was at the time was a very profitable opportunity of investment. And not in the case of Greece, where investors had a haircut of about 70% of face value of the bonds. Just for comparison, of course, I'm totally sympathetic with our Greek partners and their suffering at the time. The difference today is that we have the ECB, which is massively buying bonds on the secondary market. So I will not expect, and this intervention will last. So will be still in place for other more years in the future. So I think I don't see the possibility to have another situation like that. What's the problem? I think the only risk that a central bank faces is the inflation, So the value of money, I think you were referring to the purchasing power of households. So You would not like to see another Weimar situation before the Nazi parties took power in Germany, the so-called hyperinflation. That's the reason why in Germany people is extremely, opponent to any inflation outlook, because they have historical memory of what happened at the time of the Weimar Republic. I think the only risk for the balance sheet of central bank, basically, it's and for the operation for the policies of central banker is inflation. Indeed, the inflation targeting is the first mandate of every central bank all over the world. Now we are seeing deflation, basically. So I think we are not in a situation in which the purchasing power will be deteriorated, at least in the short term. So expectation of inflation still remain very compressed. And the reflation, so the comeback of inflation, is an hypothesis which is not in place at the moment because the sources coming from demand side, so depressional demand side, is still more powerful than the shortage from the supply side, that might induce inflation in the picture. So I think neither of the two is of your two hypotheses is realistic at the time. I will not expect, as an economist, of course, I will not expect yields of Italian bonds becoming again, skyrocketing or reaching a peak that we saw in the past crisis. And I don't think that inflation at the moment is an upside risk for the outlook. So I don't see problems coming from these two aspects, honestly.
Thank you very much, Professor Di Vaio. We have already reached the ending point of our meeting today. I want to thank you for two things. First, of course, for coming to our Zoom chamber and giving us your precious time, but also for willing to engage with us with these questions of methodology, because this is what this forum is all about, to hear interesting speakers, but to think about the methodology. And so thank you for allowing this. So thank you, Bianca, for arranging this. And one last announcement, and excuse me, Dr. Di Vaio, I'm returning back to Hebrew. לפני שאנחנו ככה סוגרים את המפגש של היום, אני רוצה להזכיר שבעוד שבועיים אנחנו נפגשים ממש כאן שוב במשבצות של הזום, אבל בפעם הבאה אנחנו נפגשים לא בשעה רגילה, אלא בשעה מאוחרת יותר, ב18:15. חלק מהיתרונות של זום זה שאנחנו באמת מארחים אורחים מחול, וחלק מהם נמצאים באזור זמן אחר לגמרי. אנחנו צריכים לאפשר להם, אנחנו רוצים לאפשר להם להצטרף בזמן סביר מבחינתם, שלא יצטרכו לקום ב3, 4, 5 לפנות בוקר, ולכן ביום שלישי בעוד שבועיים אנחנו ניפגש בשעה 6:15, ממש כאן. So thank you again, Professor Di Vaio, for this interesting discussion, and please join me in thanking Professor Di Vaio for being with us today, and I wish us all health and very productive new academic year. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you very much, and good luck to all PhD students for their future career.
Absolutely.
Okay. Stay well, stay safe. Goodbye. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.